October 12th, 1992. Seattle's Crocodile Cafe. The grunge explosion was at its peak, and every music journalist in America wanted to capture the Seattle sound before it burned out or sold out. Tonight was different, though. This wasn't a scheduled show or a media event. This was just musicians being musicians, gathering after hours in the cramped backstage area of the venue that had become the unofficial headquarters of the scene. Eddie Vedder arrived around 11 p.m. with Stone Gossard and a couple of other Pearl Jam members. They just finished a grueling 3-hour set at the Paramount Theater, and Eddie was still buzzing with adrenaline and frustration. Pearl Jam was climbing the charts, but Eddie felt misunderstood. Critics kept comparing them to Nirvana, and it was driving him crazy. The backstage area was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of cheap beer. Maybe 20 people total, mostly local musicians, a few hangers-on, some guys from Soundgarden. Everyone knew everyone in Seattle's music scene. It was small, incestuous, competitive in ways that outsiders didn't understand. Kurt Cobain was sitting in a corner, nursing a beer, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He'd been dealing with the sudden, massive success of Nevermind for almost a year now, and it was clearly wearing on him. His blonde hair hung in his face, and he had that distant look he got when he was overwhelmed by crowds, even friendly ones. Eddie noticed Kurt immediately. Everyone did. Kurt had that magnetic quality, that ability to draw attention without asking for it, without wanting it. But tonight, Eddie wasn't in the mood to be impressed by Kurt Cobain's reluctant charisma. Eddie had been drinking, not heavily, but enough to loosen his tongue and sharpen his frustrations. He'd been fielding questions about Nirvana comparisons all week, and he was tired of it. Tired of being seen as the less authentic version of something Kurt had done first. "Look who decided to show up," Eddie said loudly enough for the room to hear. Not mean exactly, but provocative. Kurt looked up briefly, made eye contact, nodded, then went back to staring at his beer. Stone Gossard, sensing tension, tried to steer Eddie away from whatever was brewing, but Eddie wasn't having it. He walked over to where Kurt was sitting. "Kurt Cobain," Eddie said, extending his hand. "Eddie Vedder." "I know who you are," Kurt replied quietly, shaking Eddie's hand without much enthusiasm. "Do you?" Eddie asked, his voice carrying an edge. "Because sometimes I wonder if anyone actually knows who any of us are, or if we're all just pretty faces selling the same recycled punk to kids who think they discovered rebellion." The room got quieter. Conversations didn't stop, but people started listening with one ear, sensing something was about to happen. Kurt looked up at Eddie with those pale blue eyes, studying him for a moment. "You okay, man?" "I'm fine," Eddie said. "Just tired of being compared to bands that got lucky with timing and image instead of substance." The words hung in the air. Everyone in the room understood what Eddie was implying, that Nirvana's success was about Kurt's look, his blonde hair, his photogenic angst, rather than musical depth. Kurt didn't respond immediately. He took a sip of his beer, glanced around the room, then back at Eddie. "That what you think we are? Image over substance?" "I think," Eddie said, warming to his theme, "that some of us care more about the music than the magazine covers. Some of us are more interested in raw emotion than manufactured angst." Kurt nodded slowly, processing this. Several people in the room had stopped their conversations entirely now. This wasn't casual backstage banter anymore. This was a challenge. "Raw emotion," Kurt repeated softly. "Yeah," Eddie said. "Real feeling. Not poses for Rolling Stone photographers." Kurt set down his beer and stood up. He was shorter than Eddie, thinner, but there was something about his presence that made him seem bigger than his physical frame. He walked over to where someone had left an acoustic guitar leaning against an amp. "Mind if I borrow this?" Kurt asked the room in general. Someone nodded. Kurt picked up the guitar, sat back down, and spent a moment tuning it. The room was now completely silent except for the sound of strings being adjusted. Eddie watched, not sure what was about to happen, but feeling like he'd started something he might regret. Then Kurt started playing. He didn't play one of Nirvana's songs. He didn't play a cover of some obscure punk band to prove his credibility. He played Alive by Pearl Jam, Eddie's song. Eddie's words about surviving trauma, about questioning existence. about the weight of being the one who lived when others didn't. But Kurt sang it differently than Eddie had ever heard it sung. Where Eddie's version was powerful, aggressive, almost angry, Kurt's version was vulnerable, fragile. He sang Eddie's lyrics about survival and trauma like someone who truly understood what it meant to be damaged, what it meant to question whether being alive was a gift or a burden. His voice cracked on certain words, not from lack of technique, but from emotion. He sang, "I'm still alive," like he wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Like survival itself was a complicated question, rather than a triumphant statement. Eddie watched his own song being transformed into something more intimate, more personal, more honest than he'd ever managed to make it. Kurt was taking Eddie's words and finding depths in them that Eddie hadn't known were there. The guitar playing was simple, just basic chords. Nothing fancy. But Kurt's fingers found notes between the notes, subtle bends and releases that made the guitar sound like it was crying. He wasn't showing off. He was communicating. Every note had purpose, had feeling behind it. When Kurt reached the bridge, that part where Eddie usually belted out his frustration and anger, Kurt almost whispered it instead. But the whisper carried more pain than any scream could have. It was raw in a way that had nothing to do with volume or aggression. It was raw because it was unprotected, honest, vulnerable. The room was mesmerized. Even the people who hadn't been paying attention to the confrontation between Eddie and Kurt had stopped everything to listen. This wasn't just a good performance. This was something deeper. Kurt was showing everyone in that room what raw emotion actually looked like. Eddie stood perfectly still, watching Kurt sing his words back to him with more understanding than he'd put into them himself. His anger was evaporating, replaced by something more complicated. Respect, maybe, or recognition. Like Kurt was showing him something about his own song that he'd missed. When Kurt finished, he set the guitar down and looked at Eddie. Not triumphant, not smug, just tired. Like performing that kind of emotional honesty had cost him something. "That raw enough?" Kurt asked quietly. Eddie didn't respond right away. He couldn't. He was processing what he'd just heard, what Kurt had done with his song. It wasn't an insult or a challenge. It was a gift. Kurt had taken Eddie's words and shown him their full potential. "Jesus," Eddie finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Stone Gossard, who'd been watching the entire exchange, walked over to Eddie. "You okay?" Eddie nodded, still staring at Kurt. That was my song, but it wasn't. It was something else entirely." Kurt picked up his beer again. "Good song," he said simply. "A lot of pain in those lyrics, real pain." "How did you—" Eddie started, then stopped. "How did you what? How did you understand my words better than I do? How did you find emotions in my song that I didn't know were there?" "I've been there," Kurt said. "That place you wrote about, where you're not sure if being alive is worth it, where survival feels more like punishment than victory." Eddie sat down across from Kurt. The confrontational energy was completely gone now, replaced by something that felt like recognition. Two artists acknowledging each other's pain, each other's truth. "I came here tonight thinking you were all image," Eddie admitted. "Pretty boy with a guitar, getting famous for looking good in photographs." Kurt smiled slightly, but it wasn't a happy smile. "I get that a lot. People see the blonde hair and think it's a pose. But it's just hair, you know? Has nothing to do with what's inside." "What's inside?" Eddie asked. Kurt was quiet for a long moment, staring at his beer. "Same things that are inside your songs. Fear, anger, confusion, pain. The difference is, you figured out how to scream about it. I'm still learning." They talked for another hour, not as competitors or rivals, but as musicians who'd found common ground in their damage. Kurt told Eddie about growing up in Aberdeen, about his parents' divorce, about feeling like an outsider in his own life. Eddie shared stories about his childhood trauma, about discovering music as a way to process emotions he couldn't handle any other way. Other people in the room came and went, but Eddie and Kurt stayed planted in their corner, having the kind of conversation that happens when two artists realize they're fighting the same battles with different weapons. Around 1 a.m., Kurt said he had to leave. He stood up, shook Eddie's hand, and paused. "Thanks for the challenge," Kurt said. I needed to be pushed tonight. Sometimes you don't know what you have to say until someone asks you to prove it. Thank you for showing me what my own song could be, Eddie replied. I'm going to think about that performance for a long time. Kurt nodded and walked toward the door. Just before he left, he turned back. Next time you want to test someone's authenticity, Kurt said with that slight smile, maybe don't pick a fight with someone who's been questioning their right to exist since they were 12. Then he was gone. Eddie stayed at the Crocodile until nearly 3 a.m., replaying Kurt's performance in his head, trying to understand what had just happened. Stone eventually convinced him to leave, but Eddie was quiet on the drive home, processing. Over the next few weeks, Eddie found himself thinking about that night constantly. The way Kurt had sung Alive, the vulnerability he'd brought to it, kept haunting him. Eddie started performing the song differently in concert, trying to capture some of that emotional honesty Kurt had shown him. But more than that, the conversation had changed how Eddie thought about authenticity. He'd accused Kurt of being image over substance, but Kurt had shown him that authenticity wasn't about how you looked or how loud you played. It was about how willing you were to be emotionally honest, to let people see your damage without trying to make it pretty. Years later, after Kurt's death in 1994, Eddie was asked about their relationship during an interview for Rolling Stone. The interviewer wanted to know about the rivalry between Pearl Jam and Nirvana, about the competition for the crown of grunge. There was no rivalry, Eddie said, his voice quiet and reflective. That was media creation, journalists who wanted a story about Seattle bands fighting each other for supremacy. The truth is, Kurt taught me more about being an artist in one conversation than most people learn in a lifetime. What did he teach you? The interviewer asked. Eddie was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. He taught me that authenticity isn't about being the loudest or the angriest or the most rebellious. It's about being willing to show people your truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable or ugly or vulnerable. Kurt was the most authentic person I ever met, and it had nothing to do with his image and everything to do with his willingness to be honest about his pain. Do you regret challenging him that night? Eddie shook his head. I regret the way I challenged him. I was aggressive, confrontational, looking for a fight. But I don't regret that it happened, because what came out of it was beautiful. Kurt showed me something about my own music that I'd never seen. He took my words and found the humanity in them that I'd been too angry to access. How did his version of Alive differ from yours? Eddie smiled, but it was a sad smile. Mine was about survival as triumph. His was about survival as burden. Both were true, but his version acknowledged something I'd been avoiding. That sometimes living through trauma doesn't feel like victory. Sometimes it just feels like existing, and that's complicated. The interviewer pressed further. Did that night change how you approach music? Everything about that night changed how I approach music, Eddie replied. Before that, I thought authenticity was about being tough, about showing strength. Kurt showed me that real strength is being vulnerable, being willing to let people see you at your most damaged and still finding a way to create something beautiful from that damage. In 2010, during Pearl Jam's induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Eddie dedicated part of his speech to Kurt's memory. He didn't tell the full story of that night at the Crocodile Cafe, but he referenced it obliquely. Sometimes the most important conversations happen in the smallest rooms with the fewest witnesses, Eddie said from the podium. Sometimes someone you think is your competitor turns out to be your teacher. Kurt Cobain taught me that music isn't about proving how tough you are. It's about proving how human you are. The story of that October night became somewhat legendary in Seattle music circles. People who claimed to have been there told versions of it for years, each slightly different, but the core remained the same. Eddie Vedder challenged Kurt Cobain's authenticity. Kurt responded by showing Eddie what authentic vulnerability looked like. Both artists were changed by the encounter, but the real legacy of that night wasn't the confrontation or even the resolution. It was what it taught both musicians about the difference between manufactured rebellion and genuine emotional honesty. Eddie learned that authenticity isn't about image or attitude. It's about willingness to be truthful about your damage. And Kurt, in teaching that lesson, reminded himself of his own artistic purpose. That October night at the Crocodile Cafe, two of grunge's most important voices discovered They weren't competitors fighting for the same space. They were allies fighting the same battle. The battle to turn pain into art, to make meaning from damage, to prove that survival, even when it's complicated, is worth celebrating. Eddie Vedder called Kurt Cobain just another pretty face. Kurt's response, singing Eddie's own song back to him with devastating emotional honesty, showed Eddie what authentic artistry actually looked like. And in that moment, both musicians became better artists, more honest performers, more genuine human beings. The lesson from that night wasn't about who was more authentic or who deserved success. It was about recognizing that real artistry comes from real vulnerability, and that the most powerful performances happen when artists stop trying to prove anything and start trying to communicate everything.